Hello, I'm Jeff Groff, Winterthur's estate historian, and welcome to part 3 of the evolution of Winterthur. Today we're going to look at the early years of Winterthur as a museum. In this image, you see the entrance gate as it would have appeared in the 1960s as you came along Route 52, Kennett Pike. But first, we're going to step back a moment. As early as 1930, Henry Francis du Pont was considering that someday he would turn his house and collections into a museum. By the early 1940s, his attorney advised him that if he was contemplating this, he really needed to start allowing a few visitors to come and see his collections. So for a few afternoons a week, just from 2 to 4, a very small handful of people could write, request a ticket, and see some of the rooms of the house. I think those requests were very committed. In the early 1940s, he also created an exhibition of 18th century Philadelphia chairs in his badminton court, the space that would later be transformed into his courtyard of historic facades. But by the late 1940s, he really decided it was time to move ahead and create the Winterthur Museum. I think a number of reasons were behind that. Partly they were financial and tax advantage reasons, but more to the point, I think he wanted to turn Winterthur into a museum and be able to enjoy it sort of through the visitor's eyes, see how it was being received by various people coming to see his collection. So as the planning gets underway, it's a fairly fast schedule, as he always did things, with the idea that it would open late in the fall of 1951. Well, up to that time, Winterthur had never been published, the rooms, in any magazine or books publications. So it's not surprising when that's finally possible that the magazine Antiques is the one chosen to devote an entire issue to the rooms and collections of Winterthur. What I found more surprising was that HF allowed a number of the more popular magazines to cover his house and collections. And I wonder when he saw the sort of headline for Saturday Evening Post, America's $20 million home, if that didn't give him a bit of pause, because he was a pretty modest man. But fairly soon, House and Garden, Vogue, Look, Life, other magazines were doing fairly extensive articles on Winterthur. I think he was delighted at the response to the house and how much interest there was in it and being able to see it. To make it all possible, he'd also created a new museum entrance. And on the left, you see that under construction on the lower level. A wing was added for paint and carpentry shops, maintenance areas to support the house. And on the right, you see the completed visitor's entrance. Those two doors there, to put it into perspective, those of you who visited Winterthur, those two doors would be about where you enter Webb Hall from the Montgomery Room today to begin your tour of the house. Well, if he was turning his house over to the museum, where were he and Ruth Du Pont going to live? They looked across the way at the tenant farmhouse that had been built for the Bittermans in 1838, a building that had been nicknamed the Cottage over the years. And so his original plan, working with his architect Thomas Waterman, was to add a fairly large addition onto that cottage. But as the project got underway, they found the cottage wasn't in the best of condition. And also for the sort of spaces he wanted for entertaining and living, it really wasn't going to work. So the cottage was taken down, and instead this 50-room English Regency style house was built in its place. I find it kind of amazing to think today that in 1951, he was creating a house with 11 servants' bedrooms and 8 servants' bathrooms. So he was still planning to live and entertain in a very large way. When it opened, he called it the H.F. Du Pont House to differentiate it from Winterthur, which was now the museum. And over the years, we've come to call it the nickname, the cottage. Well, if he was leaving his American furniture and collections in the main house to be the museum, how was it going to furnish his new residence? And for the remaining years of his life, Ruthven died in 1967. He died in 1969. This house was furnished with his notable collection of English, French, and Italian antiques that he'd acquired in the 1920s for his very grand apartment on Park Avenue in New York. Well, the interest in the museum was so great. There was a waiting list very quickly of over a year just to get tickets to tour the house. Only a limited number of people each day could go into the house to see the collections. So in 1952, they decided to add a special program that they called Winter Tour in the spring. This was an opportunity particularly to see the azalea gardens in bloom, but also see 20 rooms of the house. And this was done without advance reservations. To staff it in the house, docents provided by the Junior League of Wilmington would conduct tours or tell people about the objects in the house. But to provide what we would nowadays call visitor amenities, food service, restrooms, things like that, very sort of make-do setup was created behind the cottage and the coach house. Ladies' guilds of local churches, fire stations would provide fairly modest lunches for sale in this area. But it sort of amazes me to think of how it all worked on days in May when there might have been several thousand visitors in a day. 1952 was also the year that launched the Winter Tour program in early American culture. University of Delaware, still one of the signature programs. In the image on the left, you see the first director, Charles. By 1956, H.F. du Pont was considering the next sort of needed expansion for Winter Tour. Things were so successful, the graduate program was doing so well, that it was decided that a wing needed to be added onto the house for offices, for a new library, and for classrooms. And this building got underway in 1959, completed and opened in 1960. It was known as the South Wing. But what's distinctive, if you look at the image on the lower right, that's the rotunda, an auditorium, that it's in a very distinctly modern style, what we now refer to as mid-century modern. And you can see furnishings, Herman Miller and Knoll chairs, and this very kind of contemporary space. That's even more evident in the new library, which when we look at this image, we keep thinking that it could be something right out of the TV show Mad Men. Well, people are often sort of interested in this when they think about H.F. du Pont and his collections and wonder how this could happen, him helping fund it and it. Well, I think it's a good place that we can emphasize that H.F.'s interest in design, craftsmanship, style was always evolving. He didn't furnish his own house with modern furniture or modern collections and art, but he was very interested in contemporary design. The other thing that this new space offered was an opportunity on a non-reserved basis for visitors to come and do basically what was a timeline, a 2-century tour through the history of American interiors, decorative art. These rooms were set up to be more accurate period rooms as much as possible, using significant historic architecture. These spaces still exist today, not as period rooms, but are used for study storage, for collections, for meeting spaces, and other functions. By the late 1950s, it was so evident that the facilities could not support the volume of people for spring tour. So the next addition was planned, which was the building we know of as the Pavilion that serves as our visitor center today. It was designed in what was referred to at that time as the Bay Region style or Monterey Bay style, and is this blend of kind of California modernism with a lot of Asian influences. On the image on the right in the cafeteria area, again, you can see the use of mid-century furniture. 1961 was also a significant year for HF because First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy asked him to chair her Fine Arts Committee for the restoration of the rooms of the White House, something he was delighted to do and I think was very proud of. On the left, you see the First Lady visiting Winterthur in May of 1961. On the right, HF and Ruth du Pont in the Red Room at the White House. Well, as programs were expanding at Winterthur, there was definitely a need for a larger space for conferences, lectures, different types of meetings. And so in 1966, Copeland Hall, a new auditorium was dedicated. They could seat 350 people. It also had state-of-the-art for that time equipment for projection and for sound. School programs have always been very important at Winterthur, and in the 60s and 70s, they expanded, really pioneering in many ways the sort of interactive school experiences that still enjoy at Winterthur today. The last building that H.F. du Pont helped fund and support was the Crown and Shield Research Building, which opened in 1969, sadly, just a few months after HF's death. The main purpose of this building was to house the greatly expanding library, provide a space for students, for researchers to work, and then on the upper levels, labs for conservation, for care of collections. When the plans for the building were first underway, the architects came up with a fairly traditional sort of Georgian revival style building, but instead this more modern blend of traditional and contemporary was created that you see there on the right. With the wonderful conservation labs in 1974, the Winterthur program in art conservation, which is now the Winterthur University of Delaware program, art conservation, was able to launch. To connect the museum and the new library, the glass corridor was added. Again, this very contemporary space. Some of you looking at this might think of the work of Philip Johnson with his glass house, or Mies van der Rohe. The glass wall on the right looked up into the east terrace and the garden. Later, this space would be converted to house the Campbell Soup Tureen collection, which you can still enjoy and see there today. The last major building that was completed at Winterthur was the galleries, which opened in 1992, a space that allowed us to showcase a wide variety of some of the notable objects to tell a broader story about American decorative arts and history. And on the second floor, provide a variety of changing exhibition galleries. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this look into the early years of the museum, and in this three-part series have gotten a sense of how this remarkable house evolved into a museum with the very notable gardens and landscape around it. Thank you.